started as the other people are joining. Are we recording, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, welcome back, everybody. I think no need to introduce myself, but in case you did not have a chance to join yesterday, my name is Anthony Mukuna. I am a senior program associate at Wested, and then we are conducting this training session as part of a contract we signed with the Mississippi Department of Education to assist LEAs with coaching and technical assistance, which will put them in a position to be successful when they go through the review process next year, the fiscal monitoring review next year. So our purpose is to give you the tools, the knowledge, and the capacity to be prepared when you have conversation with MDE reviewers. And yesterday, we gave you a quick introduction of the MD fiscal monitoring process. And then we went over the regulation to show you where the Mississippi Department of Education received the authority to implement and this type of monitoring for the IDEA funds, and the Special Education Fund. And where did we leave off yesterday? We were talking about section 1 of the fiscal monitoring protocol. And then, Maury, if you can just go back to the monitoring protocol to give us like a summary of all the sections so that they know where we started and where we are going to pick up from today.
Yeah, Anthony, do you want to go to the slide that previews everything? So that is slide 22.
Yeah, 22. Yeah. Ishwa, could you go back to slide 22? Just to give us a quick transition.
Yeah. Or you know what, Ishwa? Oh, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
In the meantime, I see we have 50 participants, not too bit different from yesterday, so we did not scare them away. All right, yeah, that's the slide. So just going back to this slide, this is a summary of all the different sections of the Targeted Fiscal Monitoring Protocol, which is a tool that the Mississippi Department of Education reviewer will use when making assessments of your fiscal monitoring procedures and practices. Yesterday, we started talking about the cost principle section, which is usually called section 1. That section is a testing of allowability of your expenses under IDEA and other federal and state laws and regulations. Today, we will continue and then start the conversation regarding section 2, which is time and effort. And we'll talk about section 3, or IDEA specific fiscal requirements. So we'll talk about the purpose of the testing procedures and the type of documents that you will be expected to submit to the MDE to allow a proper review of your procedures and process. And then Maury will go over the financial management system, or section 4, and we'll close out with the written fiscal policies and procedures, or section 5. So this is just to give you an idea of where we were yesterday and where we're going to start today. So today, let's get started with time and efforts, or section 2. Isho, if you can go back to slide 28. Awesome. Time and efforts. What is the purpose of time and efforts under the fiscal monitoring system that the MD implemented? The purpose is simple. Under time and efforts, they are trying to test whether or not your salaries and benefits charged to your IDEA federal grants or to your special education state expenditures that you claim to demonstrate compliance with maintenance of efforts were salaries and benefits allowable under the grant and under the special education program. So let's say you have a staff who works for a special education program, that you're paying with IDEA funds. Now the reviewer wants to know if you decided to pay, let's say, employee number 1 with IDEA funds, what gave you what gave you the information that will allow you to pay the salary using the specific IDEA fund? You have to understand that the staff that is being paid with IDEA fund must be working in a special education program. So that's what the reviewer will try to determine. Did you in fact pay those that are eligible to be paid with IDEA funds using your IDEA funds? And what are the documents that will be requested from you to allow the reviewer to perform this testing procedure? The first document is a gross salary report. A gross salary report is the report that just shows like who was paid, how much, using what type of funding source. And then they also want to see a list of staff that are being paid with IDEA and your state's general fund or local funds that is used for MOE purposes. And that list will be a summary of the name, of the FTE or percentage. Let's say if you have an employee who is paid maybe 50% out of the IDEA fund, we want that type of summary that could give us like a breakdown of how much is being used for the total position, full-time position out of IDEA. And then another document that you will be expected to submit could be semi-annual certification and personnel activity report. So these are just the documents that will be expected from you to allow a reviewer to do this testing procedure. And if you move to the next slide, this next slide is just a reminder of the standards that is established under the federal regulation and the Mississippi Department of Education. And then I would ask Alicia, if she's in the call, to stop me or correct me if I'm saying something that is in contradiction with the guidance that comes from the Office of Grant Management at the Mississippi Department of Education. So basically, the time on effort standard is pretty simple. You are required to complete a semi-annual certification if you have an employee working in a special education program and paid with a single funding source like your IDEA funds. So 100% of the time, and the money comes from IDEA, every 6 months, you make them sign a certification attesting that they worked for the purpose of the IDEA program. You could also have an employee who worked in a special education program, but that is being paid partially with a combination of funding source. Maybe a portion is your IDEA federal grants, and a portion is your general fund MOE. We see it a lot when, for example, you have staff that needs to be paid, but IDEA is not enough. So you need to find other funding source to supplement what is missing out of your IDEA fund to be able to fully compensate the staff. So this is a good example. In that situation, also, you could have them sign a semi-annual certification attesting that they worked in the IDEA program. And then the second layer of supporting documentation that will be expected from you is the monthly personnel activity report. We usually call it PAR. And when are you expected to maintain this type of documentation, which you will be required to submit to the reviewer? A good example is if you have a staff working in more than one education program. Let's say you have a paraprofessional who does special education work 30% of the time, and maybe does some Title 1A work 70% of the time. So you're paying you will be required to pay the staff using different funding source because they're serving different programs. And then most of the time, maybe the time that is being spent on a specific program or activity is not the same. It could change from day to day. It could change from weeks to weeks, or it could change from month to month. In that situation, a personnel activity report is the most appropriate type of documentation that you need to maintain and submit to the MDE to show how you came up with the conclusion that I paid my staff using IDEA funds for time they spent on the special education program. You should not pay staff who do not work in your special education program with IDEA funds, because that then will become a non-allowable expense for salary and benefits. This is just a quick summary of what will be expected from you. And then, do we have any questions before I move on? Yeah.
No, I think we're good.
So I think Alicia is good. Okay, let's move on. Let's go to the next slide. This slide is just to give you an example of what a gross payroll report would look like. When a reviewer wants you to submit a gross payroll report, like I said yesterday, similarly to your detailed expenditure report, depending on the type of accounting system that you use, these reports could have a different name. And I think Alicia from the Office of Grant Management told us that she will be providing the type of accounting system and the specific type of reports, so that when we start having our coaching session, so when we go to Vegas and we have our coaching session, we will know what are the specific reports we need to mention when we coach you or train you on how to run those reports. So, do you have a question? Come on. No, good. Okay, and a gross payroll report would include, at a minimum, like the funding source, the function codes, the dates, the name of the employee that is being paid, how much was paid, and a short description of the type of the transaction. So these are just the minimum type of information we want you to reflect when you run your gross payroll report for the specific fund that you will be asked to prepare. And then if we go on the next slide, again, this is just an example of a semi-annual certification. If you have a semi-annual certification that looks different, it's not a big deal. The most important thing is that you need to make sure that your certification form captures all the essential information. Like, for example, the employee name, the position, what is the reporting period that they're certifying? If it's like from January through July, then you need to specify that within the certification form. And also, you want to include the program where they are working, the funding source, and preferably, I would also include like a fund or function code, so that it helps the reviewer clearly understand where the portion of the salary was coming from, or where the totality of the salary was coming from. So it just helps the communication between you and the reviewer, who will be doing cross-checking between your certification and the gross payroll report that you submit. And then if we go to the next slide, this is an example of a personnel activity report, or PAR. Like I said, when you have a staff working on multiple programs, multiple type of activities, and paid from multiple funding source, and especially if the time changes from day to day, then you will probably need to track the efforts toward a specific education program daily. Because if you don't do it daily, you could easily forget. For example, me, when I work, I will not be able to tell you how was my day last Monday. I wouldn't be able to tell you, like, I spent 4 hours doing maybe a training session or 3 hours reviewing documents. That's the reason why, completing those PAR daily will be helpful for you, because if you wait so long, then you will probably forget how much time was invested or allocated to a specific education program. And then this form will need to be signed monthly and also reconciled with your payroll report. Because the purpose is what? You're paying your employee using maybe a percentage out of your IDEA funds. And then the PAR will give you a supporting documentation showing how much time of the total FTE was invested in a special education program. That will allow a reviewer to determine if what is shown in the gross payroll report is the appropriate proportion or percentage when it's reconciled with the personal activity report that lists the time that the specific employee spends on the specific program. So it's really important. It's a really good internal control tool that will keep you out of trouble, especially when it comes to salary and compensation of staff for IDE funds. And if we move to the next slide, this is a screenshot of the list of staff paid with their FTE. Like I showed you in one of the previous slides, the reviewer will want to see who are your employees that are being paid with IDEA funds. Who are the employees that are being paid with your funds that you use for maintenance of effort under IDEA? And then what is their gross wage? And also, when you do your budgeting or your planning, what is the FTE that's for each specific employee, for each specific funding source? This document is also a document that will allow a reconciliation, cross-checking, because there is a cross-checking that needs to happen between the supporting documentation, which could be your semi-annual certification, the personal activity reports, to your planning tool, which is the list of 8 staff by FTE, to the actual, what was actually paid, the gross payroll report. And then if you're able to submit this documentation, that will help move the process quickly when the reviewer goes through this testing procedure. And like I said yesterday, submitting the correct information is really important, is a key. Because I can tell you, I am a former auditor. When an auditor does not understand something, they're quick to try to issue findings. So that's why you have the responsibility to make a job easy for a reviewer to see what they want to see, so that they won't have any confusion and maybe issue unnecessary findings. All right. This is all about the example of supporting documentation. I think the next slide is a poll. But before we get to that, do we have any question, or am I putting you to sleep? I forgot to warn you that you should probably get some coffee before this type of training to stay awake. All right, no questions? All right, then let's go ahead and launch the poll. So we are going to test your understanding of what was just shared. All right, for section 2, time and effort, what are the documents you should prepare for the review of time and effort, section 2 of the targeted fiscal monitoring protocol? A, gross salary report for Fund 2610, 2620, 1130. B, list of staff paid with IDEA and MOE fund, which will include the names, FTE and funding sources, up to 6 semi-annual certification personal activity reports or timesheets, and D is all of the above. So always look for the better answer.
Give it 10 more seconds before I close the poll.
Yeah, thanks, Isha. Like I said yesterday, some of these questions are tricky questions. Always look for the better answer. Don't quickly jump into the first answer that you see, which could be right, but when you have a multiple choice question, the correct answer is always the better answer. All right. So this is the result. 90% said all of the above. And then we have 3% for C, 5% for B, and 3% for A. So which tells us that at least 90% of the people were paying close attention to what was just shared. But if you selected A, B, or C, you're not wrong. But D was the better answer, because you need to submit A, B, and C when you gather the documentation and evidence for section 2. Thank you. If you can go to the next polling question. So, again, which document is not, read the question, which document is not relevant for time and effort section 2 of the targeted fiscal monitoring protocol? That means it's not a document that will be needed by a reviewer. Question, answer A is gross payroll report. Do you need to submit gross payroll report for time and effort section 2? Yes or no? List of staff paid with IDE and MOE fund, up to 6 semi-annual certification of HAR, or D, invoice and or purchase order. So
give it another 10 seconds, then I'll close the poll.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to close the poll now.
All right. This is the results. Again, which document is not relevant? That was the key. So invoice and purchase order is not what is needed here. If you were paying attention yesterday, when the reviewer does expenditure testing to determine a liability of specific cost purchase, then invoice and purchase order comes into play. But when it comes to salaries and benefits, invoice is no longer relevant, because here we want to capture time spent, your system of control, to show how much was paid and if it was allowable. So D is the correct answer, and then 90% of the people got it right. A. So you guys got an A. 2 in a row. Really encouraging. Really encouraging. Thanks. If we can go to the next slide. Now let's talk about section 3 of the targeted fiscal monitoring procedure or protocol. This is a testing of IDEA specific fiscal requirements. And under the IDEA specific fiscal requirements, the most important one is the maintenance of effort. The reviewer here is going to want to determine whether the expenditures that you reported and used to determine whether or not your LEA was in compliance with maintenance of effort were allowable. Because you can submit a report with big numbers, like let's say we spent 4 million out of our state special education funds for special education purpose. But how can we determine whether or not within the 4 million, maybe 1 million were expenses not related to the special education program? Because that could happen. We have seen LEAs reporting, let's say, 4 million of total special education expenditures, but when we go and then dive deep into the detail of the expenditures, some of those expenditures were not related to special education at all. That's the reason why the monitoring is time for a reviewer to determine whether all these costs that were included in the MOE are allowable special education expenditures that can be counted towards maintenance of effort. And we also have a testing for the private school proportionate share expenditures under IDEA, and the Coordinated Early Intervention Services or CEIS report. And then to do this testing, the reviewer will need which document? Detailed expenditure reports that includes expenditures used for maintenance of effort purpose. So here, like yesterday, you want to make sure that you select an expenditure that will give an itemized list of payment transactions so that the reviewer can do an individual test of all the costs that were included in the total amount used for MOE. Same thing with CEIS report. You would need to submit an expenditure report of your CEIS expenditures that will show line by line item of what was paid to determine whether or not the specific payment was tied to an approved CEIS activity in your budget. Same thing for the private school proportional share. You would want to show some type of documentation to track how you came up with the expenditure that could be counted towards your private school proportional share obligation. Because under IDEA, if your LEA has a private school located within the geographical boundaries, you have to set aside, if you have students eligible to receive special education program, you have to set aside a portion of your IDEA fund for special education, so for services provided to students in the private school. You have to have internal control or mechanism to document how you are meeting that requirements from your IDEA expenditures. So the reports is important, and also, like I said, supporting documentation for private school, CIS, and then school-wide process if applicable. But from my understanding, I don't think in Mississippi, LEAs do school-wide under IDEA. So it's not something that we have seen. And then MD, correct me if I'm wrong. But CIS and MOE is pretty common. Private school proportional share and CIS. And if we go to the next slide, we wanted to include this example just to reiterate what was said yesterday. Expenditure report for your maintenance of effort funds, if it's like the funds 1130. We have a minimum information that must be included in those reports. And then Alicia is going to share with us the specific name, like I said, and then when we do our coaching sessions, we will know exactly what type of report you should be looking at when you run those reports from your accounting system. And then this again includes the minimum amount of information that must be included in a detailed expenditure report that will allow a reviewer to do a test for individual costs charged to MOE. And then the next slide is the private school proportional share documentation. So this is just to give you guys an idea, because when we were doing the pilot of the fiscal monitoring, this is an issue that we saw coming quite often. Because under IDEA, when you have expenditures for private school proportional share, most of the time it's like you are using your own LEA staff to provide services to children with disabilities in a private school, for example. And if you pay for the salary or benefit of this teacher or the service provider, sometimes you could easily combine those into like a normal payroll processing. Or you could just identify specific codes to, single out like those private school expenditures. But the reviewer now would want to know if, for example, out of the total salary of a specific teacher, if he was being paid 40,000 and maybe 2,000 of the time was for private school proportionate share, a reviewer would want to know how you came up with that amount. How did you determine that out of the total 40,000, only 2,000 should be for private school proportionate share? That's where documentation comes to play a key role. This example is just an example of the private school support documentation, where a teacher who provides services in a public school under normal circumstances and maybe spend a portion of the time providing services to private school students, then they could be tracking activities in a sheet like that. It doesn't have to look exactly like this example, but this is just to give you guys an idea of what type of documentation you want to maintain to show that if I determine that 2,000 was for private school, this is how I came up with that total amount. Track the time, hourly rates, and then the total. So, any questions about it? I know I spoke a lot, and then some of this information could be a little confusing, but hopefully as you hear it over and over, and maybe if you join our coaching sessions, if you come to us with us to Vegas, this will become more familiar for you. If we don't have any questions, I will let Marie take it over from here to go over section 4 of the fiscal monitoring protocol. No questions?
Hope that was appropriate Zoom wait time, but feel free to include any questions in the chat or just to unmute yourself at any point in this presentation. So section 4 is the financial system review. And this is where we test the efficiency and effectiveness of your financial management system and how you're managing your IDA federal grants to ensure that you're meeting both the IDA requirements as well as the MDE financial management requirements. And during this test, what we're really looking at is we're looking at those budget versus expenditure reports for funds 2610, 2620, and 2611, if applicable. And we'll go over what those documents look like in the next slide. We're also going to be looking at your IDA GAN award notification. And just as a heads up, your GAN awards are included within your MCAPS funding application in a document library tab. So that just in case you're not exactly sure where to locate this document, this is another thing that we would be able to help you with. But really what we're trying to do is to ensure that your financial management system is accurately identifying the sources and the amounts of funds awarded to them. So verifying those IDA allocations and carryover amounts. We'll be comparing both your local package to your MCAPS package. So we're going to be looking at how much money you're budgeting within each of these during each for each object, and making sure that you're not going over your budget or you're not modifying your budget within your local package without reflecting those revisions within MCAPS as well. We'll also be looking at your accounting system to make sure that all of your funds are tracked separately and that they're not combined or conflated with any of the other IDA funds, or including state funds as well. So 2610, 2611, 2620, those are all separately being accounted for. Another thing that we'll be looking at is any carryover balances and how you're identifying those carryover balances. We're going to be looking at, all right, this is how much for 2610 they got this year. How do they have such a high carryover, or how do they have such a high amount that isn't being documented through a carryover line or any other mechanism for being able to demonstrate where that additional money is coming from. And we'll also be looking at your indirect cost rate. So we'll actually be comparing that indirect cost rate that you're requesting for reimbursement to make sure that that's the correct percentage that was used, and verifying that if you're using a separate indirect cost rate, that letter is on file. So Ishwa, do you want to go to the next slide? So hopefully this will all look very familiar to you all. So these are the areas that we'll be expecting to see within the budget versus expenditure report. The fund, any description, the object, and then the object description, adopted budget versus current budget, year-to-date balance expenditures, and then the remaining balances. And again, we'll be comparing this over the course of, based on the different budget versus expenditure reports that you're submitting, we'll be comparing this with what is included within MCAPs, again, to make sure that there's alignment between the adopted budget, the current budget, and the year-to-date balance expenditures. Anthony, did I miss anything on this section?
No, you're good.
Okay, perfect. Are there any questions about this one? This one is again, it's pretty straightforward. We're just trying to make sure that there are appropriate internal controls in place.
And what I can add is that, typically, like some LEAs don't have that practice of having an adopted budget versus a current budget. They usually operate their budgets using the adopted budget line column. But current budget is a good internal control practice. And the reason is because budget adoption usually goes through board's approval, and the boards may be meeting like twice a year. So you don't want to wait until the board approval to make adjustments to a tool that you use daily to make programmatic and budgeting decisions. So that's the reason why it's a practice that we really encourage LEA to implement within their financial management system.
And to piggyback onto that, I mean, again, as part of our technical assistance, what we will be offering is suggestions. So areas that are not necessarily going to be found in non-compliance, but areas that we know will help to improve your internal controls and help to really mitigate any non-compliance in the future. So if you are just looking at suggestions on how to improve current practices, this is definitely a place to take advantage of as well. Ishwa, if we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And our last section, so last but not least, we have our fiscal policies and procedures. So we're testing the existence of written policies and procedures in compliance with the Uniform Grant Guidance. And essentially what we're doing here is we're just reviewing those fiscal policies and procedures to determine that all of the sections that are required under the Uniform Grant Guidance are easy to locate and understandable, current, up to date, and include all of the, the regulatory language that are necessary. Under the Uniform Grant Guidance, there are a number of fiscal requirements that have to be in writing. And also within the assurances that your LEA sign annually, there are, again, a number of assurances that are as part of the Uniform Grant Guidance. So our testing covers the fiscal requirements that should be or are included in IDEA. And when you're receiving your IDEA grants, then you are required to have these areas in writing and in compliance with the requirements.
All right, we have a question.
Yes.
So Kimberly was asking, when will these be available to rewatch? I think she's referring to the recording.
That is a great question. Bobby, do you want to chime in with that? We will be sending you all of the recordings in the next day or so with all of the PowerPoints once those get 508'd.
Sure. So once we receive them from y'all, Maury, at West Ed, we will send them out, depending on how long the length of them are. If we can send them out on email, Kimberly, if not, we'll post them and send you the links or tell you where they're posted on our website.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bobby. So within the next week, we'll say, so hopefully sometime within the next week. Perfect. So again, those documents that are requested are the written policies and procedures in compliance with the Uniform Grant Guidance. What's important to note here too, is that sometimes within LEAs, there are different types of funding manuals or fiscal policies and procedures. So there might be one that is specific to IDA or special education, and then there might be some that are broader and that there are district or LEA wide. So again, since a lot of these procedures that we're looking for are under the Uniform Grant Guidance, it may be that your policies and procedures are located in different places. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. One thing we've definitely seen is, for example, one of the components of the fiscal record retention requirements that is related to all federal programs. So it might be that isn't specifically included within your IDA or special education fiscal policies and procedures, but that you'll have to piecemeal it from other areas or guidance documents from your LEA. Ishwa, if we want to go to the next slide. And I got ahead of myself because Here we have a list of all of the different policies and procedures that we will be looking for. So specifically, we're looking at cash management. So what is the process for drawing down on a reimbursement basis after obligations are made? We want to see how often these are submitted and how often you guys submit requests and how you are reviewing these for duplicate payments. Written allowability procedures. So we're looking for what's the process to determine the allowability of cost? We want to know the details. So who is approving what, and how do you know if a cost is allowable? So really looking at is it necessary, allowable, allocable, written procedures around procurement. So we're looking for language around micro, small, and large purchase processes. What does competitive bidding look like? Suspension and debarment verification processes. Inventory management. So we're looking for the criteria for tracking inventory definitions, frequencies, making sure again that that's aligned with what is required under uniform grant guidance. So at least once annually. The time and effort requirements. So we're looking for those procedures like Anthony was talking about around your PARs and your semi-annual certifications, how that is verified, making sure that that those are based on actual work time spent, not what's included within a contract. Again, time and effort. So yes, written conflict of interest. So we're looking to make sure that those conflict of interest addresses actions to be taken when there is an appearance of or actual conflict of interest. And then written travel policy. So again, we're just making sure that you have that travel policy in place. Another area that we do look for, and I didn't see it here, but is those fiscal retention of records. So we're looking for a minimum of record retention for at least 3 years after the grant is closed. And one thing that we're looking at more holistically across the board is separation of duties. So we want to make sure there's separation of duties for expenditure approval and cash management. How many people are approving what, and how are those checks and balances put into place? It's important to note again that some of these policies and procedures may be district-wide policies because they are based on federal awards. So, all federal awards that are required to adhere to the uniform grant guidance, they might have similar processes and procedures. There are some that are going to be specific to special education. So right when we're looking at the allowability of costs, that's going to be very specific to IDA. There might be some overhead and redundancies in terms of looking at what that looks like within the uniform grant guidance. But then again, we have that extra layer within IDEA. So trying to keep in mind and knowing who to reach out to within your larger LEA office who might be able to provide you these will be really helpful.
And Maury, so I just saw a comment from Alicia was saying that all the districts have this procedure for federal program. And then she just suggests that grant management suggests reviewing this procedure that have been established for a federal program and adapting to IDEA requirements. So that's a really good point that Alicia made. For example, if you already had a written procedure for time and effort, I think that written procedure for time and effort should be good for all your federal programs. You don't need to have one specifically for IDE. Same thing with inventory management. So you might have already have those procedures in place. So don't be looking for like time and effort for special ed or inventory management for special ed. That's not what you should be looking at. Really good point.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And when we meet to provide technical assistance, that's something that we can definitely discuss more in depth where you could be looking for each of those pieces. And yeah, Bobby, exactly. That is one thing that MDE noticed last spring during monitoring is that sometimes an LEA would just submit their special education specific fiscal policies and procedures. And then there would have to be some follow-up conversations like, wait, there's this missing. And then they found out, oh no, well, that's actually in our larger LEA policies and procedures because it pertains to all of the programs. Any questions about written policies and procedures? Another thing to note, I will just say really quickly, is that time and time again, the Uniform Grant Guidance gets updated and there are new citations specific to the requirements. So that's why it's recommended to review these, your policies and procedures annually, especially in relation to any updates to the regulations. But again, that's an area of technical assistance that we're able to provide as well. Okay, if we could go to the next slide, please. So now we have a couple of polls. So the first poll, which of the following procedures are required to be in writing under the Uniform Grant Guidance? So A, cash management procedures, B, allowability procedures and time and effort, C, procurement procedure and inventory management, or D, all of the above. So again, keep in mind, Anthony's tricky. At a first glance, it might seem obvious, but as you continue reading down the list, it may, a better response may rear itself.
Yes.
We're getting a lot of responses. We really appreciate your participation in these polls. And we do use them to grade ourselves as well. So we want to make sure that what we're presenting is clear and that you guys have the information that you need ready at hand.
All right, I'm going to give it 5 more seconds, then I'll close the poll.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to close it now.
Fantastic. So for cash management procedure, we have 3%, allowability procedures and time and effort, 3%, procurement procedure and inventory management, 10%. And again, those are all correct answers, but the most correct answer, as if this was a standardized test, is D, all of the above, and 85%, a solid B, responded with that. So thank you so much. And next, we have one more poll for you. So which of the following policies are required to be in writing under the Uniform Grant Guidance? Time and effort, conflicts of interest policy, travel policy, or all of the above? And again, thank you for your participation in these polls. And Ishwa, let's just give it another 5 seconds or so and we can close this one out.
Okay. All right, I'm going to close the poll.
So here, again, all 3 of the top answers are 100% correct. Time and effort, conflicts of interest, and a travel policy, but the most correct is all of the above. So, and 93%, I'm going to say that's a solid A, Anthony. And
you move from B to A.
Exactly. I'm so glad. I think they're catching on to your questions. And again, thank you all so much for your participation. Ishwa, if we could go to the next slide. For the sake of time, we're going to go through these a little bit quickly. So we already covered the fiscal monitoring report. So we can go to the next slide, actually, Ishwa, that would be great. So kind of as a preview, you can do a little test drive of our technical assistance skills. We went through and we made a list of common findings and strategies that we've seen with LEAs within MDE. So the first, of course, is around the allowable use of funds. And I will say that this is one of the most important findings of noncompliance because the consequences are very severe in relation to what can happen. So if you're found to have costs that are not allowable, potentially that would allow MDE to disallow those expenditures and you'd have to repay that money back to MDE, who would then repay that money back to the federal government. And what are we seeing? So really, we're just seeing that LEAs are not submitting adequate descriptions to demonstrate allowability. The required reports, again, are those detailed expenditure reports. And our strategy is always documentation, documentation, documentation. When you're going through and you're selecting those invoices to submit, double check them, make sure that they are expenditures that you will be easily able to demonstrate that they are allowable, reasonable, necessary, allocable, all of those pieces. If you're going through and you're looking at an expenditure that you're going to submit preemptively, you could always just add a description, right, to demonstrate how it is allowable under IDEA. For those of you that attended the allowable use of funds training that we did last year, you know, through the polls we showed, a lot of the times it depends. It depends on how well you're able to demonstrate the allowability of a cost. The next is around cost principles and expenditure detail or expenditure testing, excuse me. So there we just saw discrepancies between internal expenditure reports and MCAP's requests for reimbursement. So making sure that you are clearly able to differentiate which expenditures are being reimbursed for which reimbursement requests. So sometimes we saw that it wasn't clear when a reimbursement request was submitted, which expenditures were actually included. So it could include expenditures that were from months and ages before. Again, we understand that the period of performance allows some flexibility, but you still need to be able to trace it back. And so the required reporting for that, again, is the detailed expenditures and revenue report. And the strategies is doing frequent reconciliations between MCAPs and the internal accounting system, or specifically when you're submitting documentation for monitoring, that you're looking at that prior to the submission of documentation. I'm just making sure that everything aligns to avoid a lot of back and forth, or if you need to submit additional documentation, hey, this expense was included here, or et cetera, that you're able to kind of point those out on the front end. Anthony, did you have anything you wanted to say about these?
No, we're good.
Okay, cool.
I have 7 minutes left.
Yeah, I know. Sorry. We're going to go through these quickly, but again, this is the type of, these are the types of conversations that we can have during these TA calls. If we go to the next slide, please. So for time and effort, we did see some issues with this as well. And I think that, again, this is a really, is a very high priority area for your LA, because again, the consequences are repayment of funds if they're disallowed. So really quick, one of the findings was not submitting sufficient time and effort documentation for staff. Again, we require a certain number of documents to be submitted. Please do submit those, or the reviewers will go through and they'll select for themselves which staff they want to see additional documentation for. But again, obviously on the front end, making sure that you're documenting all of the time and effort spent on special education program and activities using the appropriate form of documentation. And you know, one thing that we saw definitely is that sometimes with employees that are full-time FTE, if their job description changed, then potentially the type of time and effort documentation that they were submitting did not align with what was actually being paid out to them. So if they move from being special ed to gen ed part of the day, and they're still reporting 100% under IDEA, you're going to have to make sure that those semi-annuals or PARs reflect the actual time and effort being spent for a federal program, especially IDEA, or all federal programs, including IDEA, excuse me. The next piece is, again, just double checking the submitted time and effort documentation and comparing it with the gross payroll report. So especially before submitting for monitoring, make sure that whoever staff semi-annual certifications and PARs you're submitting, their names are included within the gross payroll report that you are submitting, because without that type of verification, there's going to be a lot of questions coming back to you. And again, sorry, we only have 5 minutes, so we'll get through these next slides really quick. And the last pieces were, or no, excuse me, there's 2 more slides. So just for the financial system review, one thing we noticed was that there was no carryover amount. So there was no way to determine how that the entire IDEA Part B 2610 amount came to be. We see that it's larger than the allocation that was provided, but there's no way for us to determine how much was being carried over from prior year awards. And then the other thing was discrepancies between budgeted and expended amounts. So we want to make sure that we're comparing budgeted and expended amounts so that the expended amounts are not greater than those that are budgeted for certain categories. And if we could go to the last one, that would be perfect. And then the other 2, just really quick, were around the record retention requirements and then cash management. So those were just 2 that we realized were missing from a lot. And again, for record retention requirements, these are likely included in your broader LEA policies and procedures. And then for cash management, similarly, we were missing additional details around what that process actually looks like and who's responsible. Now, if we could actually, I'm going to take this over really quick. We have a really brief evaluation survey that we are going to put the link to in the, oh, excuse me, we have one more poll, sorry. How would you rate your knowledge of the targeted fiscal monitoring process now? And we know that this was a really quick training. We probably could have made this a 4-hour training to really get into the weeds of all of these pieces. But again, this was just kind of a precursor to what types of technical assistance we are available to provide on all of these components. And I know that we're still getting some responses, but we're going to go ahead. Please get your final answers in. We're going to close it out in just 5 seconds so that we can get through the very last slides.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then and we hope that we'll have a lot of people joining us for the Vegas conversation, for the closing session.
Yes. So hopefully everybody was at least able to bump up one notch. So we see some very strong. There's a lot of fares. That's completely understandable. This is a brand new system. There's a lot of technical language and technical requirements. So especially all those folks that responded fair, weak, and of course, strong and very strong. We would love to work with you all. I am going to pull up this slide one more time. And Ishwa, while I'm doing that, could you do me a favor? We do have a quick evaluation survey. We'd love for you guys to fill it out. This helps to inform future sessions and to help us improve. So it should take no more than 4 minutes, I would say. If you have a chance, please do that. And then in the last 2 minutes, again, I just want to go over the WestEd activities that we are available to support you with. So again, in preparation for your targeted cyclical monitoring next fall, in the fall of 2022, WestEd is available to provide technical assistance and coaching to LEAs to, one, develop an understanding of the MDA fiscal monitoring protocol. Again, this was a really quick review, but we can go through question by question and explain what is MDE going to be looking for and how are you going to be assessed based on these. To better understand MDE's expectations. So again, thank you so much to Alicia and her whole team at the Office of Grants Management for having all of the names of those required reports. We know that that is very difficult to do. You have tons of reports that you're running for tons of different requirements. So we can help you determine which reports you need to run. And then again, evaluating what type of appropriate evidence you should be submitting and some strategies related to that. We can also do a review of your LEA fiscal policies and procedures. So that is probably the most universal level of technical assistance or coaching. You would just give us your LEA fiscal policies and procedures. We can tell you where updates are actually required and where they would be beneficial. And then lastly, we can do a mock review of sample materials with you to identify and address any potential findings of non-compliance. And this is the most intensive, I would say, because it would require you to actually gather, specific evidence as well as some required reports. We would go through and review with you and help you determine what exactly, what areas would benefit from some improvements and what could be potential findings of non-compliance. I know that we're right at the top of the hour. So again, thank you so much for attending this. I'm going to re-put in the survey link. My apologies for the confusion with that. I hope that this one is working. If it's not, we will also go ahead and send this out to everybody in the follow-up email with all of the materials. We did catch a typo within the funding procedures that we provided and sent out yesterday. So we're going to be sending out a new version of the protocol. It said back versus bank, but we want to make sure that that is extremely clear. And we'll send out that. If you haven't signed up for your TA call yet, please let us know, or please feel free to sign up for the TA call. Again, every LEA is required to participate in at least one TA call, and we will be we'll be sending out a link to that as well. And I apologize. I know we're a minute over. Are there any questions before we get off? And feel free to stay on the line for another minute or so if you have any questions.
All right. Thank you so much for attending. So I hope this was helpful, and then we look forward to meeting you in those more individualized technical assistance sessions where we'll have an opportunity to do a deeper dive into the process. Have a good afternoon.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.